Steve Geis. I'm Director of Operations for the Visitor Complex, and I'd like to welcome you tonight. We're pleased to be the only venue in Florida showing Apollo 13 in IMAX, and we're glad you can be here to be a part of the premiere festivities. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I've seen this movie a couple times in the theaters, and I have it at home, seen it a bunch of times, but you've never seen it like this before. Now, before we start, I'd like to introduce you to two American heroes whose real-life story became this movie that inspired thousands of people and made us realize once again that the space program is the nation's best example of triumph and teamwork. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Apollo 13 Commander Captain James A. Lovell and Apollo Flight Director Gene Kranz.
Center. It seems like old days again that we're back here. And it seems like the Apollo 13 movie never seems to quit. Now it's in the IMAX form, and we're happy that we could show it to you here and also be here during, I guess, sort of its first showing here at the Kennedy Space Center. I might tell you a little bit about the IMAX movie itself. The corporation had for the very first time taken a 35mm print and expanded it to 70, then used computer enhancement to remove the graininess that would normally occur with expanding the film. And they did that as an experiment, and they were trying to figure out what kind of a movie should we take, what theatrical movie should we use to really test this whole concept out, and they decided to take the Apollo 13 movie and do it. So they got together with Ron Howard, the director, and started to do the movie. Now, IMAX films normally that you see are no longer than 45 minutes or maybe an hour at the most, and a lot of them that have been done for the theaters, of course, have been done by our own astronauts up there with these big 70mm IMAX cameras. The first one was The Dream Was Alive, which I think you all remember, a great movie. So what Ron Howard did was to take the movie as he made it originally, which was 2 hours and 30 minutes, or 2 hours and 20 minutes, and the IMAX people said you can't have a 2 hour and 20 minute movie because the film would be so heavy it'd take 3 men and a small boy to move this stuff around, and so you're going to have to cut the movie down. So he did edit the movie, so what you're going to see tonight is an edited version of the original movie down to 2 hours rather than 2 hours and 20 minutes. And perhaps you can, those of you who've seen the movie can maybe figure out what's missing. But I think actually what happened was Ron Howard managed to tighten up the story a lot, make it very, very effective. So I have seen the movie, of course, and I have to tell you it's very, very good. So Gene, come on in here. Gene was the lead flight director, of course, and a very prominent figure on the movie itself. So why don't you tell us what you thought about your particular role in the movie?
I told Jim in the car coming over I was a nicer guy than Ed Harris. And I also think I was a bit better looking. But since I couldn't afford to bring Ed down here, they shipped me in this evening. I really enjoyed the movie. I'm very proud. I was not only the flight director, I was the division chief for all the flight control. So basically, my organization provided the flight controllers for the Mercury, the Gemini, the Apollo missions through Skylab, even to the current days. And I particularly liked the way that they portrayed my young controllers. These were a bunch of kids, most of them fresh out of college, 24, 25, 26 years old, that had signed up to do a job that when we first started off, you almost believed was impossible. Our training ground was just down the road here, and it's really marvelous to be back to Kennedy today and see basically the birthplace of this thing that was called the space program. So we'll talk to you later on. Have a good one. Enjoy your movie.
Your host for this evening, former Public Information Director for NASA at KSC, and the voice of the Apollo missions, Jack King.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here with you and to serve as your host tonight on this special occasion. As the first order of business, I want to introduce the two ladies who grace the presence of our two honored guests, Marilyn Lovell and Marta Kranz. Marilyn and Marta, so what do you think of Apollo 13 all over again? It's about the fourth time for me, I think, and this is the first time in IMAX, and boy, it just wowed me, and I agree with you all. It really, really brings it home again, as it always has in the past. You know, one of the most intriguing things to me about the movie itself is that the NASA cinematographers produced outstanding footage over the years of the Apollo program. But for a number of reasons, especially some of the stuff that that NASA had out on the separation of the Saturn V stages and that early stuff that we saw that was so dramatic. But it turns out Ron Howard and his people couldn't use it. As Jim mentioned to me tonight, all of that stuff was in 16 millimeter. So it's quite amazing when you think that Ron Howard and his crew did all that stuff on their own. And it certainly came home to me, really. I thought the effects were magnificent. The only minor problem with the movie was that I don't know who did the countdown, but we'll have to check on that later. It's a great movie, but the only thing that's greater is to have lived it. And I'm one of the fortunate people who had the opportunity to do that. Compared to these two guys who are up here on the podium, I was on the sidelines, if you will, providing information, battling with the press, and trying to tell the NASA story. But I'm proud to have been a member of the team. I came here first as a newsman in 1958 and joined the NASA team when it was first established at the Cape under Kurt Davis in 1960. It was the golden age of manned spaceflight, if we want to look at it that way. It was a unique time. As you saw in the movie, and as we all know, at that time we were in a race with the Russians to go to the moon, to see who could get to the moon first, and time was of the essence. Every mission was a calculated, exciting step forward, and every mission was important in its own right. As I look back, special moments stand out. Alan Shepard becoming the first American in space. John Glenn, the first American in orbit. Ed White performing that daring spacewalk on Gemini 4. Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott spinning out of control and then recovering their spacecraft on Gemini 8. Then came the lowest point in the program. We lost Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White in the Apollo fire. But as it turns out, there was a resurgence 10 months later when we launched the first Saturn V successfully, and the program was on its way. Next came Apollo 8, a bold move to put 3 men in a spacecraft on the top of a rocket that had only flown twice and send them around the moon. Of course, that was Jim's flight. And I guess the closest I ever came to tears was to hear Jim, Frank Borman, and Bill Anders read from Genesis on Christmas Eve on that magnificent flight. Then there was Apollo 11, the crowning achievement. And then there was Apollo 13, the moment of triumph. Apollo 13. To my mind, Apollo 13 was the greatest triumph over adversity in the history of the space program. And come to think of it, it's one one of the greatest triumphs over adversity, perhaps in our history, when you think about it. Also, you know, these two gentlemen have given us another special thing. Actually, they have introduced two phrases into the English lexicon, the lexicon of the English language, which everybody will recognize and remember long after we're gone. Those two phrases: Houston, we've got a problem, and failure is not an option. Ladies and gentlemen, when John Glenn returned to flight on the STS-95 mission 4 years ago, Lisa Malone, the countdown commentator, appropriately described it as the launch of 6 American heroes and 1 American legend. Well, move over, John. We have 2 more American legends here tonight, and it's my honor and privilege to introduce them to you. Ladies and gentlemen, the real-life Ed Harris, who was, is, and always will be Houston Flight, Gene Kranz.
I'd like to thank you. This is a spectacular evening, and it's really, I want to thank you for coming out here and participating in this event and contributing to the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation. This is a marvelous program that hopefully is going to educate the young flight directors and the young astronauts of the future. And God hope we're going to have young astronauts and young flight directors in the future. You know, shortly after the Apollo 13 mission, I was asked a question. They said, if I had asked you before the mission, as a flight director, could you solve a problem where you lost your oxygen tanks, you lost your fuel cells, you had to power down the spacecraft, basically you were 200,000 miles from Earth, could you have gotten that crew home? And I answered, hell yes. And they'd say, prove it. And I'd say, no, I could not prove it, I just know it. I know the quality of the team and the controllers that we had and the leadership we had. And it all began right here at the Cape. You know, in 1960, I was a young engineer, 27 years old, who had just joined the Space Task Group, and my training ground was just down the road in Mercury Control. I'd been on the job 2 weeks, and I was asked to come down to the Cape and write the countdown and a set of mission rules for our first launch. I came down and the aircraft landed at Patrick Air Force Base, and I didn't even know which way the Cape was from Patrick Air Force Base. That was how naive I was about the program. But we had spectacular leadership. We had a guy by the name of Walt Williams, who was the toughest man I've ever known. He was a brawler. He was more fitted to working as a longshoreman than leading the American space program, but in the business of flight test, he was a legend. We had a guy by the name of Christopher Columbus Cry. And Chris was the pioneer in mission control. He launched each one of the Mercury missions. And most importantly, though, he formed this thing called mission control. He was our mentor, our teacher, our tutor. You know, in Project Mercury, we were going to fly a spacecraft that was moving 5 miles per second with the first 3 7090 computers ever produced by IBM. Serial numbers 1 and 2 were up at Guard, and they had a prototype system that we had. We had a reliable vacuum tube computer out in Bermuda. We had a communications network that dated back to the days of America's Pony Express. If we were lucky, we could send 60 words per minute over a teletype network, and we spent as much time in Project Mercury practicing Morse code as we did learning about the mission and the spacecrafts that we would fly. We sent young men to 13 tracking stations around the world. They went into the heart of Africa. They went to Zanzibar. They were in ships at sea and islands in the Pacific. And these were sites that were literally at the ends of the earth. And the risks to these young people was very high because the 60s was the end of the European colonial period. The controllers in Africa were twice rescued by the Army. At Zanzibar,
My controllers would go to work each day, and the British had just relinquished rule over that particular island. There were 4 parties fighting for domination. And they would decapitate roosters and throw them at the controllers as they'd go to work. We actually formed behind the thick of the Queens Raraffos, or the Gordon Highlanders. They'd surround the tracking station during work periods, and when they were through, they'd bring the controllers back at night. Sometimes they couldn't even bring the controllers back. They'd stay at the tracking station. But these young people grew to be the leaders that we used in Project Apollo. And really, when I answered that guy's question, yeah, we could have done it. We could have done it over and over and over. It was because of the leadership that we learned in these early years in the space program. We made a lot of mistakes, but we corrected those mistakes and we moved on. What a magnificent vision was given to us by President John F. Kennedy. He said, go to the moon and do it in this decade, and do it because it's difficult, and we did. And I just hope that in the years to come, our young people will find that same kind of leadership, that vision, which will inspire them to do the difficult things. And in the years to come, that we will go to Mars. So yes, we could have done Apollo 13, hands down, and that's why this crew came home. You know, we had difficulties. The thing that surprised me about the movie was that so few people knew how difficult problems that we had faced in the earlier Apollo program. When we landed the moon, we had less than 17 seconds of fuel remaining before we shut those engines down. Apollo 12, we got hit by lightning. Apollo 13, you know the story. Apollo 14, we had to invent a software patch in 2 hours to bypass the abort switch that would enable our crew to land at the moon. 15, we had a couple of cardiac problems. 16, with Ken Mattingly, we had problems with the steering controls for the service propulsion engine. But we solved each one of those problems because in mission control, we will never surrender a mission, we will never surrender a crew. Failure in our work is not an option.
We're going to get him back here more often, I'll tell you. Thank you, Gene. And I'd like to introduce the chairman of the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, a 4-time spaceflight veteran, the commander of Apollo 13, and to show you what Tom Hanks looks like, Jim Lovell.
Gene, after hearing that talk, I'm so inspired I want to re-up again. It's a pleasure, of course, for me to be here too. My many times down here, but I always enjoy coming back down to where I really enjoyed part of my career here. My most famous and knowledgeable part of the career that I've always remembered was my time at the space program, so it's nice to be down here again. And it's nice to know that you're all thinking about the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation. I took over when Al became sick, and we're struggling now to keep scholarships coming into young engineers and scientists through college, and hopefully they'll join the aerospace industry to help us keep the space program going. I thought I would digress a little bit from the blue and gold shot that Gene gave, and kind of because you all just saw that movie. And I thought I might digress, tell you a little bit about that movie, how it got started, what happened, why did we have a movie anyway in the first place? Because it was about 25 years since the flight, came. But what happened was the fact that when the three of us got on the carrier after the flight, and we looked at each other, and we dusted ourselves off, and we saw that we were still alive, we said, we ought to write about this. Even before the explosion, it was sort of an interesting flight. And so all three of us vowed that we would, put it down on paper, the occurrences and the story about Apollo 13. But the best laid plans of mice and men are often go astray. And what happened was the fact that we had other things to do. in our careers. After we had sort of left NASA, Jack Swiker went into politics. Fred Hayes went into the aerospace industry, and I ended up in the telephone industry. Jack unfortunately died in '83, and so there was just the two of us left. And when I retired from the telephone industry and I came back, the company gave me my office and a secretary for a few months to wind down, and so that the cultural shock of my wife seeing me at home wouldn't be too strong. I looked at my secretary and I said, look, what should we do? We don't have to worry about telephones any longer. And she said, why don't you write that book you've been telling me about all these years? I said, good idea. And so I tried to figure out how to get started. I'm, of course, not a professional author, and I started to call up all my friends who were still in the control centers, you know, at NASA and people like that, to get the ideas and their views of how things went along in the flight. Dug out all the old flight plans and the accident reports. And about that time, I got a letter from a young man named Jeff Kluger, who was a writer for the Discover magazine. I think it's one of the Disney magazines. And anyway, he said, I've never written a story before. Always thought I'd want to. And I think Apollo 13 would make a very good book. Would you help me? Well, I wrote back and said, that's what I want to do. Anyway, I liked his style of writing, so to make a long story short, we got together, we co-authored a book called Lost Moon. Now, we had just written one chapter, and we wrote that one chapter as a proposal to go around to various book publishers to see who would back us and publish the book. And finally, we got a publisher. They said, all right, we'll give you 1 year to write the book, and get started right away because we kind of want to publish this in 1 year. So I sat back in my office and I thought, boy, hey, this will help me keep me off the golf course. And about 2 months had gone by, and we hadn't written another word. Just that one chapter, and we were, you know, doing research, interviews, and things like that. And I got a call from our agent, and he said, "Are you sitting down?" And I thought to myself, uh-oh, there's a remorse clause in the publisher's contract that says if we're not satisfied in 30 days, this whole thing is no good, and send the advance back. So I said, yes, I'm sitting down. He said, we just sold your book to the movies. I said, we haven't written it yet. Isn't that slightly illegal? And he says, no, it's done all the time. What we actually sold was an option to do the story to a company called Imagine Entertainment, Ron Howard's company. And I found out later, he buys 2 or 3 options every year to figure out what he really wants to produce. But what turned the option into a finished product was a young man about 11 years old, closet astronaut, space enthusiast, knew the names of all the astronauts and all the flights and where they went and what the problems they had. And he was 11 at the time that I had made this flight, and of course his name was Tom Hanks. And when Universal heard that Tom Hanks was going to be on the movie, because Tom had lobbied Ron and said, look, I'd like to be on this movie. I always want to play this part of an astronaut. Any place in this movie, I want to be on it. And so Ron got Tom, and when Universal heard that Tom was on board as a lead actor, they provided, of course, the funds and the facility to do the movie. The first thing that Ron did was to send a crew down, a casting crew and set designers down to the Johnson Space Center to do some interviews of all the people that were still there and to look over the mission control site so they could reproduce it in the studio. And the only actor that was assigned at that time was Hanks, and he came down with Ron Howard. And we have a house in about 50 miles west of Austin, and so they knew that we were in Texas, and they invited us, Johnson invited us over there to be part of the host. And as I was taking the crew through, and Tom pulled me aside one time, he said, look at Jim, I have to know more about you. I have to know your mannerisms and how you speak and your idea of the flight from your perspective so that I can accurately portray you in this movie. I said, well, Tom, I have a home just about 50 miles west of Austin. Why don't you fly down some weekend, spend the weekend with us. You can meet my wife. I have these flight plans. And accident reports, and I got some video. We kind of go over the whole thing, give you an idea. He said, fine. So he flew into Austin. I own a small airplane, and so I was over at Austin, picked him up, put him in the airplane to fly him over to our house, a place called Horseshoe Bay. And when he got into the airplane, I noticed this fella was a little worried. You see actors and actresses, they're used to 747s or big corporate jets or something like that. But I kind of figured that this fellow was going to play the part of an naval aviator, a test pilot, and an astronaut. We got to get started right away. The flight from Austin to Horseshoe Bay takes 15 minutes. I took an hour and a half. I try to do those things I did years ago as a test pilot, approaches the stalls. I noticed that he wasn't saying too much over there, but he hung in. And finally, during a quiet part of the flight, I was trying to think of something to say to him, and I was flying along, and I said, Tom, when we heard that you're going to be in this movie, my wife and I ran out and saw your latest movie, Philadelphia, and congratulations, you did a great job. You got the Oscar for that movie. And he said, thank you. And I was trying to think of something else to say to him, and flying along, I said, didn't you make another movie after Philadelphia? He said, yep. And I said, what was the name of that movie? And he said, Gump. I said, Gump? He said, yep, Forrest Gump. Now, that movie had not yet been released. I knew nothing about the movie, so I said, well, Tom, tell me about that movie. What's it all about? And Tom Hanks proceeded to tell me the story of Forrest Gump. And I thought to myself, Houston, do we have another problem here? Surprisingly, the movie you saw tonight, which is a shortened version, of course, of the one that first came out, which I thought Ron Howard did a good job of editing, was quite accurate. Most of the incidents, of course, that you probably know, a lot of you know, are all true. A little artistic license taken into it, but basically it was a very true movie, and we're all happy that he did the movie and people accepted it. But some of the real things about Apollo 13, and as Gene had mentioned, it was really a test of human attributes, ones that changed failures into successes. The attributes are characteristics of good leadership. Leadership, like James setting up this Tiger team, getting going, and getting a teamwork together, so we work as a team, where he calls in contractor people and other NASA people to figure out what went wrong, and better, how do we get these guys back home again? And then, of course, there's this imagination that they use, this thinking outside the box, whereby they were never faced with those crises before, those problems before, such as the carbon dioxide building up, and how do we get back on the path to get them back home again, because we had moved over to a course to the moon that should something happen to the spacecraft and the moon would swing us around, the closest point back to the Earth would be about 40,000 miles out, much too far out to be captured by the Earth's atmosphere. And then how to figure how to use the lunar module as a lifeboat to get home. And when we got into the lunar module, I learned something very important, that flying or maneuvering the vehicle from the lunar module with the dead command module attached required a whole new learning, because the lunar module had never been designed to have a 60,000-pound dead mass hanging on one end of it. And so the center of gravity was way out to one end, and all the maneuvering had to be relearned from what I had learned in the simulators. All these things were very important. And then, of course, how the team got together back at the mission control to figure out how to provide enough electrical power to get back into the command module so we could then power up the command module, because it was the only vehicle that could get us through the atmosphere. And the lunar module itself, nice lifeboat, but had no heat shield, never designed to come back home again. And it was designed only to be powered up in lunar orbit, because it was only designed to last 45 hours, just to go down, land, explore, and come back, rendezvous and dock, and then we threw the vehicle away. And then again, we had another problem, because it was designed only to support 2 people. And here, I kept counting the crew all the time, 1, 2, 3. I knew that we were in serious trouble. These were the problems that these attributes, like leadership and teamwork and innovation and perseverance, because a lot of things they came up with turned out not to work, and they had to fall back to square one to start all over again. And of course, motivation, a highly motivated team. So those are the things that turned what was almost a certain catastrophe into what I've often called a successful failure. And it's all basically due to the teamwork between the flight crew and the ground crew working together to bring the spacecraft back home again. And I agree with you, Gene, that failure was not an option. Thank you.
I think these two gentlemen covered everything, but just in case, we'll be happy to take some questions from the audience. I think they probably answered all your questions, but certainly if you have any, we've got microphones right here in the back. Just raise your hand, and we'll be happy to try to take on your questions. Right over here, sir. Oh, right here.
When the show talks about gimbal lock, what exactly does that mean?
Okay, let me try to answer that. Gimbal lock is a case of the gyros having the gimbals lock in a position. We had on Apollo a 3 gimbal platform. It was designed for Polaris. And Polaris had a certain course that would always be flown off the submarines. And it had, so there was a certain attitude that could suddenly cause the gimbals to line up, which would then cause the gyros to tumble. Gemini, on the other hand, which we all think is a earlier spacecraft of different vintage, actually had a 4 gimbal platform and would never encounter gimbal lock. In the control panel, in the instrument panel of the Apollo, we had, of course, what we call the 8-ball, and in the middle of that, on either side, was a red ball about the size of a nickel. And if our attitude got to be in such a position that the red ball started to come in the center of the instrument, that means we are approaching gimbal lock. And if that ever occurred, the gimbals would tumble. We'd lose our attitude reference to the celestial sphere, which we needed to navigate with, and we would not know which way to point the spacecraft when the ground told us a certain attitude to go to, so we can maneuver to get back, like on the free return course and things like this. And that's what gimbal lock was all about. So we had to be very careful every time we maneuver the spacecraft, and we changed the guidance system from the command module to the lunar module, that we never got into what we call gimbal lock.
Thank you, Jim. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering, maybe I didn't study my science well enough, but when y'all were coming back and they said they didn't have quite enough weight because you didn't pick up the moon rocks, if you're weightless, what difference does that make?
No, that's the definition of the center of gravity in the spacecraft, because basically you're maneuvering the spacecraft through the reentry process. Remember, we're now starting to come back into the Earth's atmosphere, so we now do weigh something. So it was, this allowed us to control the ranging of the spacecraft so that we would land at the exact landing point we were targeting for. Basically, we had to dissipate any excess energy.
And the vehicle is really a lifting body. So it has the lift vector, and the lift vector tells you whether you're going to go over or under your target, or right or left of the target, and the weight had to be in a position so that they'd know.
Does anybody have a more technical question like that? We've got some hands up over here. Where's our microphone? Oh, back here. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir. 2 questions. You mentioned the artistic license that Hollywood took. When they show the re-entry in Earth's atmosphere, they show it looks like a full-blown typhoon. Was that artistic license, or was it actually fairly well developed? How close was it to the re-entry zone? And also, a question for Mr. Lovell, what type of plane did you fly Tom Hanks in?
The Typhoon was in the process of developing. Remember those days, we didn't have satellites, weather satellites that you used. So basically, we were relying upon the naval forces in the vicinity of the landing point. They were reading atmospheric pressure. The Typhoon's name was Typhoon Helen. And when I came back in from the rest period, after they had done the return, actually when We had finally finished the maneuver to accelerate the journey back to Earth. We had 3 problems. Basically, it was getting colder in the spacecraft and our water system was freezing up. The Navy wanted me to change the landing point, and then we also found out that actually we were off our return trajectory, or in a skip-out trajectory, so the typhoon was a very unwelcome distraction at that time.
And my airplane at the time I flew Hanks was a Baron.
It's hard for me to recognize people because of where the microphone is. I suggest the microphones find some people.
Mr. Lovell, 7 years ago you spoke at my high school, and at that time you just inspired a lot of people. And I know growing up I've been very inspired by the space program, and I'm just now starting my career. And I just want to know, with 2 marquee names like you guys have, how does it feel to be inspiring kids who are 5 and 6 to enter the space program now?
Well, of course, 7 years ago I was inspiring kids. I guess I still am now. I feel about 7 years older right now. I'm just hoping that our space program has inspired children, because one of the things the space program should do, and has done since 1957 when Sputnik went up, was an inspiration to the education of our young people, and to spur that education on for more and more children to get a good education, whether it's in the sciences or not. I think that's one of the objectives of our space program.
And I talk to the NASA co-ops down at Johnson 3 times a year. I believe the youth is the energy for the space program. If we are to continue on, it is your energy that is going to man the trenches in mission control and on board the spacecraft. What I also hope to do is generate a group of people like yourselves that I call the foot soldiers of space. You are the ones who are going to have to sell space to the Rotaries and the Kiwanis, the Knights of Columbus, your church groups, etc. You're the people who got to carry the message. We try the best we can, but we're too few. You're the ones that got to carry the message. Thank you.
Folks, we have an awful lot of hands up, and we're going to do the best we can. We've got 1 microphone over here. Do we have another mic over this way?
Just doing one at a time over here, so here's one more.
Gentlemen, the expression Houston, we have a problem, is a fairly good provenance. Where did failure is not an option come from, please? Was that made up for the film?
It was made up for the film. What was most interesting, it took off after several things. Throughout the time that we were down in the data room where the entire team was forming up, when I closed the meeting, I told the controllers that we've never lost American space. We sure as hell aren't going to lose one now. This crew's coming home. You gotta believe it. Your team's gotta believe it. We gotta make it happen. This crew's coming home. And I believe the scriptwriters believed that was too long to put in the movie. So they shortened it to failure is not an option.
Boy, you're really telling tales tonight.
This question is for Mr. Lovell and Mr. Kranz. Preparing for the movie Apollo 13, what would you say was the best piece of advice you gave to the actors that portrayed your characters?
Please say it one more time, please.
In preparing for the movie Apollo 13, what would either of you say was the most important piece of advice given to people who portray your characters?
Well, the most important advice that I gave to them when I met them all was to really do an accurate job portraying what actually happened. Because it turned out that the first script was so bad that I didn't want any part of it. And finally, the actors themselves took the air-to-ground transcripts and read it, and then changed some of the words so that the audience would understand what they're talking about, and really use that to make it a very realistic movie. And so that was my advice to the actors, and of course, they did a very good job.
And from my standpoint, I never met with Ed Harris, so I never had the opportunity to speak to him. I had just finished 12 hours of interview for the US PBS and TVSI over in Japan. Ed Harris got the raw video of the interview, and then he hired 2 of my controllers to coach him on my manners and techniques. So I believe my controllers, Jerry Griffin and Jerry Bostic, did a spectacular job in getting me ready.
There were a lot of plates during the early part of that.
Yes, hi, tonight. My name is Cesar. I have 2 questions that I wrote in Spain, and I have it here for you. My father and I would like to know, the first question is for Mr. Lovell. What do you feel today when you look at the moon?
What do I think of today when I look at the moon? Well, I think that I sometimes wish I was one of the people that landed on the moon, but then I realized that what we did on 13 had such an inspiration for the people who were not born when we actually made that flight, to give people the incentive to do a good job and to find out what people could do if they put their minds to it, as the team did at Mission Control. And then I look at the moon, I think to myself, well, take a little romance out of the moon for me. So, but all those things, of course, I'd love to go back there again. And someday I think we will go back.
Well, you know, speaking of that, if John Glenn did it, let's take a look at these two guys.
I offered to be John Glenn's backup. He told me I was too young.
Thank you very much. And the second one is for Mr. Kranz. Do you think that the epic and sense of adventures of the space missions has been lost nowadays?
I believe that for the young people who work in mission control and fly on board the spacecraft, no, I think the sense of adventure is still there. I talked to young people and many groups throughout the United States. The young people still feel that sense of adventure. I believe the people, many of the people have lost it to the politicians. Those people must support the program. So that is why we must get to them and create the sense of adventure in those older folks. The young people still got it.
First of all, to both of you gentlemen, I have to say, the first time I saw the film, I'm over here, I apologize. It was the first film that made me cry at the very end. And you've been an inspiration to not only myself, but my little brother. And he pretty much goaded us all into coming. I have a lot of homework I have to do. And I saw my little brother's face. He's like, I get to go meet Apollo astronauts and mission controls. I'm like, God, I can't miss this for him. So my question is, what were both of your thoughts when you first realized something was wrong?
Well, let me mention it from the spacecraft point of view. Of course, we heard the explosion. We didn't know what happened. I looked at Fred Hayes. He didn't know what was going on, and I looked at Jack Swiker, and he was trying to figure out just why he was there, since he was the backup. And then we first of all saw a light come on that said essentially we had an electrical problem, and before we could digest that, we lost 2 fuel cells. But we still had a fuel cell that was operating, and even though the landing on the moon was off, the one fuel cell would give us enough electrical power to get home. So at that time, there was a big wave of disappointment at that particular period, until I moved over and saw the quantity gauges on our oxygen tanks, 1 0, 1 going down, and then when I looked out the window, I saw the gas escaping. And then that's when the old lead weight went down to the bottom of my stomach. You know, that searing sensation you get when you're in deep trouble and don't quite know how to get out of it. And so that was maybe, in the spacecraft, was probably the low point where we didn't know what was wrong just yet. We knew that we were in deep trouble because we were losing all of the oxygen, and we didn't have the solutions yet that were being generated then to finally get us back home.
From my standpoint, it took me about 15 minutes to really cotton to the scope of the problem. On the shift where the explosion occurred, my team had already seen 2 electrical glitches. One associated with oxygen tank 2, and another one associated with the high gain antenna, the communications antenna. So as soon as we saw the indications of the problem, immediately went through the mind, hey, we got another electrical glitch. We're going to solve the problem, get it unpacked real quickly. About 5 minutes later, the crew and one of my controllers indicated that they had a pretty big bang associated with this event. And then a controller came to me and said, hey, it looks like we got a whole bunch of valves that were shot closed. I then went into the mode, hey, tread carefully lest we're going to make whatever problem we got worse, because I had seen a similar problem in the Apollo 9 mission. The one that really got to me was about 15 minutes after the explosion, when Jim was looking outside the hatch window and he said, we're venting itself. And that's when basically I went into survival mode. It was no electrical glitch. It wasn't a trade easy. It was survival.
And sir, with all that homework, Mrs. Lovell will be glad to write a letter to your teacher.
We have a Cub Scout over here that was the question.
Jim, were you a kid?
Were you a Cub Scout when you were a kid, Jim?
Yeah, I was a Cub Scout, then a Boy Scout, then an Eagle Scout, and so...
Excuse me, I apologize, I'm a little nervous, the opportunity to speak with two great gentlemen. Mr. Lovell, Mr. Kranz, I grew up a few miles from here, and I watched the space program out my back window, and became very inspired today. I'm a fellow jet aviator, and I guess the question is a little bit more personal, just something that after watching the movie so many times and seeing all the things that have gone through and reading the book, when typically an emergency happens in an airplane, it's a pretty short duration of time, like the situation you had, I guess, in the Banshee. In the situation we're involved in, you're talking about an emergency that dealt with life and death that lasted for days. And I know what it's like to have to deal with certain issues like that and you know you're going to have a resolution, you know, within 20 minutes, 15 minutes, or an hour. But I was really wondering how did you deal with it mentally? And I don't know if it's an appropriate question or not. It's just, how did you deal with that mentally for days, knowing that you had this incredible work schedule that you had to complete, and still had this incredible issue looming over your head as to whether or not you were going to make it or not? How did you deal with that mentally to keep yourself out of the dark part of it, and how did Mr. Kranz help the crew?
Well, I'll start out. First of all, we were in a position whereby we had no choices. I mean, we saw the problem. Our low point, as I mentioned before, we saw the oxygen escaping. We didn't have solutions yet. But I relate this accident. As a matter of fact, since you're a pilot, most aircraft accidents are caused by a series of things that go wrong that either overcome the pilot and or the airplane. And this was exactly a classic case of an airplane accident where there was a series of things starting years before we even took off that caused the accident. But I look upon the accident itself like you play a game of solitaire. You keep pulling up a card, and if you can place it someplace, the game continues. When you pull up a card and there's no place to put the card, that's the end of the game. That never occurred on Apollo 13. Every time we had a problem, we found a solution to it. And we kept on doing that as we went along for 4 days. Because as I had often mentioned to Tom Hanks, which he put in the movie, hey, we could have bounced off the walls for 10 minutes and we'd be right back where we started from again. And so we had to settle down and figure out what we got to work with and how we're going to solve the problem to get home.
And from my standpoint, I had grown up in aviation, and I had worked with many of the members of my flight control team for almost 10 years preceding this accident. So I had an enormous amount of confidence in team members. I had confidence in their ability to pull together to find answers to questions that just seemed unanswerable. So really, I didn't, throughout the entire mission, I never really fretted, worried about whether this crew was coming home. In fact, in the media, I was considered arrogant because I would never consider surrendering a crew. And I don't think any flight director worth his salt that made it to the position of flight director would ever consider surrendering a crew. So, you know, if you got a no surrender attitude, you're going to find solutions to the problem. So, teamwork is composed of leaders who trust each other with a common set of values that binds them together when times get tough. Then you got a team, and that's what we had.
I was just going to suggest that there are a lot of people over here.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to cut
I've got a lot of people who have their hands up for a long time. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to just everybody tonight. There's a young lady here who's been for a while. I think this will be our last question for the evening.
How do you think it would have affected the mission if Ken Mattingly had gone?
How would the mission have changed if Ken Mattingly had gone? Oh, actually, of course, you know he never got the measles. The mission would not have changed. the movie sort of predicts, there's two artistic licenses taken in the movie, which Ron Howard, when he did the movie, saw a good subplot and he could not refuse to do it. The first one was Jack Swigert himself. The movie sort of depicts Jack Swigert as trying to earn his wings every day because, which was true, the last couple of months of our training, the backup crew went back there and got the hotel rooms and got all the invitations out, did all that kind of work. And did not get into the simulator because the prime crew hauled the simulators in the last month or so. That was typical of just about every flight. But when Jack Swigert got on board, we trained with him 2 days after we had the switch. And Jack Swigert actually wrote the malfunction procedures for the command module. So if we had to replace anybody on the flight crew with regards to problems with the command module, Swigert was the guy to have on board. So we were very lucky in that respect, and he was really part of the team from the beginning. The second piece of artistic license was Ken Manley, who's now called TK Manley, but Ken Manley appears in the movie that he was, because he was bumped off and he had the measles, that he came back and really figured out how to put the electrical power back into the command module's batteries to give us enough electrical power after we separated to get it back home again. He was part of that team, but he was not the only person. He'll be the first guy to admit that. There was a team of people, engineers and astronauts, especially Ken, who got together to make that go. So Ron Howard saw a couple subplots, but that's the actual situation.
Yeah, let me add a couple on there. When we broke down, we really I formed 3 sub-teams. One which started working immediately on the reentry procedures, another one to figure out how to accelerate the journey home, and the third one was how to perform maneuvers with the navigation system down. TK basically was a floater. He would move between the various teams. And Ken's propensity is to ask the questions that I wish I had been smart enough to ask. Ken always had the ability to focus on what was the core problem, and if he could get the answer to that one, all the other answers and all the other problems would fall into place. So Ken was basically a floater. He was very valuable to my team.
Well, I guess according to the rules of the House, we're going to have to break up at this particular point. We're sorry we couldn't get to you all, but we appreciate being with you tonight. And let's say another hello to these two fine gentlemen.